Hi, it's Lyle Lansdale, Program Chair of the Washington County Historical Society, coming to you from the Brown House. And I'm here with Dr. Charles Twombly and our trusted, technologically savvy President David Brooker, who has been doing our videos and doing a wonderful job. Thank you. I'm going to introduce Dr. Twombly. I'm going to call you Charles, but as our speaker for the spring program. And I have this image that Charles told me about a long time ago, how in 1969 he arrived on the Nancy Hanks and he got off that platform in Tennille, and these two principals were waiting for him, George Williams and Elmas Williams, no relation, both really well-known principals. And that's such a romantic image to me. I always go, but can't help mentioning it again. But Charles right away met Tarver Averett. He's a person that we also remember for many years in the teaching world in Washington County. And sadly, we lost him a few years ago. But the two of them were teachers in a segregated black school. And the very next year, integration occurred in 70-71. And Charles says that Washington County went through that experience very smoothly. And I think that's a remarkable compliment to be paid to the county. As for Charles's credentials, he had an AB degree from Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California, Master's of Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. And then he traveled to Tennessee to visit his parents and found that he didn't have the credentials to teach in Tennessee, but he could in Georgia. And he came to little old Tennille, Georgia, basically from California, and then roomed in a rooming house with Miss Willie Woodall. And he taught at first at D.D. Crawford Elementary for a year, and then from 69 to 70, for 10 years, from 1970 to 1980 at Tennille Elementary School. In the 1970s through 2000, he taught at Washington County High School. So he taught lots of you people out there, and you know who he is. In the meantime, he got more credentials at Georgia College and somehow or other managed to get a PhD from the Division of Religion at Emory University in Atlanta, which is quite a feat, and why I wanted to bring out the fact that he is Dr. Twombly. And so I'm here to say that we are lucky to have a scholar to have taught in our schools all those years, and we are glad that he and his teacher wife, Sheila Twombly, are also still here with us. Thank you.
The biggest event in Washington County history was surely the visit that General Sherman paid to us in 1864. You'll recall that his army was sweeping everything in its path, all the way from Atlanta to Savannah and eventually to Raleigh in North Carolina. His troops devastated farms, burned cotton, killed livestock, and helped themselves to crops and other foodstuffs. In the process, they burned down our courthouse and jail. Apart from the intercession of community leaders, far more devastation could have taken place. Either way, our county was set back for years. Amazingly, given the resilience of our ancestors, the recovery was quicker than we might have suspected. Within a few decades, the county was thriving again. I'm standing in the very house where Sherman spent Thanksgiving of 1864. I'm in the Brown House, now a museum. on North Harris Street in Sandersville, only a few blocks from where the courthouse stood and the rebuilt house courthouse stands today. Yes, Sherman's invasion was our biggest historical event. But I'm here today to talk about another big moment in our history. My topic is the integration of our public schools around 1970. It was part of a bigger story that was regional and even national in scope. The civil rights legislation of the 60s called for a big change in many areas, and we became part of that change. It is a story that needs retelling, both for those of us who lived through it, and for our children, and for our children's children, who otherwise might be left in ignorance of what happened. We owe it to those who follow us to keep certain memories alive. Not so we can wallow in guilt or past failures, or to romanticize a past that never really existed, but to give perspective for the present and for the future. As William Faulkner famously said, "The past is never dead. It isn't even the past." In short, it lives in a subterranean way that can either energize us or undermine us secretly by being denied or ignored. So here I am, ready to give some glimpses of the big change to the school system that happened a half century ago. I'm not a native of Washington County, or even of the South, though my great-grandmother was part of a slave-owning family in Kentucky related to the Clays. I'm sorry to admit that, even though family lore tells me that this family treated its slaves very well. As we confront the past, that is part of my past. I can't pretend it doesn't exist. But as a non-native whose growing up years were spent in California, what qualifies me to speak to an enormously important event in the history of Washington County? Yes, I grew up in California, but came to Sandersville in 1969 by way of Memphis, Tennessee, where my parents had moved, and where my father was the executive director of a large Goodwill Industries plant. I wanted to teach, but at the time had no teaching units. Public school teaching in Memphis was out of the question. I narrowly missed getting a post at the prestigious Memphis University School and decided to try elsewhere. Through an interesting chain of circumstances, I got an offer to teach language arts in a little school in Tennille, Georgia. Like a lot of folks ignorant of local pronunciations, I thought the town was Tennille. Anyway, I grabbed the opportunity and flew from Memphis to Atlanta. From there, I took the Nancy Hanks, I had no car at the time, and ended up in the depot in Tennille one hot September evening. I was greeted by two black men, and was whisked to the Motel Clinton, where they arranged for me to stay for one night. It was all a bit surreal. I chuckle a bit about the meeting at the depot. It always reminds me of the train scenes in the movie In the Heat of the Night, a movie that had come out 2 years before. The two men I met were both principals. George Williams, who later became a close friend, was at T.J. Elder Elementary School. Almus Williams, who was to be my boss, was at D.D. Crawford in Tennille. So here I am, having spent my most recent years in Metro LA and now finding myself in a small rural town in central Georgia. The next day, Elmans picked me up and took me to see the school and meet some of the faculty. The very first person I met happened to be the only white person on the faculty. It was Tarver Averett, later to become a principal and eventually have a long tenure as county school superintendent. Tarver was the soul of generosity. He took me all around Sandersville and introduced me to all kinds of people. He then helped me find permanent lodging at Mrs. Willie Woodall's house on North Harris Street. Between Tarver and Miss Willie, I seemed to be known everywhere I went, even by people I'd never seen. Nearly everyone was warm and generous. But how does all that impinge on school integration? A full answer might fill up a book. I will confine myself to just a few things. For starters, let me talk about what it was like to be a white person in a black school. This experience is part of the answer why I've been invited to speak on our topic. The slogan of the day in Georgia and elsewhere, at least among many white communities, was separate but equal. The hope was that if smaller schools could be consolidated and new schools, comparable in quality, could be erected, the need or wish for integration would disappear. So new schools did pop up, largely replacing little schools, many of which had been in rural churches. They now close their doors, those little schools. Superficially, black schools and white schools look pretty much alike, but on closer inspection, the reality was somewhat different. At D.D. Crawford, Tarver and I were surrounded by a core of really solid teachers, mainly women, who were generous and welcoming to two very inexperienced fellows. Thanks to a teacher shortage in Georgia, we were allowed to teach while working on teaching units in the afternoons and in summers. Neither one of us was a certified teacher. Our colleagues were ready to assist. But two or three problems remained. For one, the supposedly equal building was not equal. There was no air conditioning in the classrooms, and classrooms were often sweltering and dusty. They were often also overcrowded. I myself taught between 180 and 200 7th and 8th grade students every day. And the materials I taught were greatly inadequate. For all my students, I had a single set of spelling books and a single set of grammar texts, which I used both for 7th and 8th grade students. These books were tattered from overuse and could not be taken home for homework. Quite possibly, they were hand-me-downs. Along with barely adequate buildings and woefully inadequate materials, black schools, at least the one I taught at, faced another problem. Because of a teacher shortage, the solid core of excellent teachers was supplemented by others who seemingly came out of nowhere. Since I came without a teaching certificate, I might appear to be implicating myself here, but I have in mind people who had possibly been failures elsewhere and were problematic in one way or another. I recall at least a couple of teachers who came to school intoxicated and had to be driven home. Yes, this could have happened in integrated schools as well, but I'm sure segregated all-black schools had a special problem. But let's focus on 1969 and 1970. Those old enough to remember will recall that things started heating up around then. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 called for full-fledged integration of schools, a prospect that filled many with dread. When it finally came to our county, it was easy for me to remember that the transition was smooth and basically peaceful. Bobby Garrett's portion in Cotton to Kalen, The Amazing History of Washington County, that was published in 1989, reminds us that those years saw endless boycotts, marches, and other demonstrations of one sort or another. There was dissension not only between racial groups, but also within racial groups as well. One recalls the bitterness between leaders of the SCLC and the NAACP. Sandersville even made the national news. As for integration of schools, an attempt was made locally to effect a compromise. Our superintendent at the time went to Washington to tell a Senate committee that Washington County citizens favored a freedom of choice plan, whereby any student was free to enroll in the appropriate grade at any other school. A small handful of students actually did make a change, but the plan was rejected by Washington as inadequate. Division in the white community wasn't quite as visible. It seems that our local Episcopal church on First Avenue in Sandersville was the only venue where community leaders could meet for biracial discussions. But other meetings were held, often in schools. I recall one public meeting presided by Dr. William Rawlings Sr., in which there was serious rumbling urging the defying of the national command to integrate. Dr. Rawlings calmly but firmly told the assembled group that we would have to obey the law. Folks calmed down and even seemed, to me at least, to be relieved. Integration took place full steam ahead in August of 1970. Happily, we now have fine schools led by able administrators of both races who lead highly qualified teachers who teach often eager students. We have a lot to be proud of. Perhaps the solid achievements we have made were already foreshadowed in the years of strife and fearfulness of change. Let me close, I should say, with a story that might back up that notion. When I lived for 1 year as a bachelor at Miss Willie's house on North Harris Street, I was a voracious reader and often visited the Transylvania Library on the town square, a block or so away. One afternoon, there was a very long line of protesters, stretched all the way from beyond the courthouse to the Board of Education office, which was at that time in a building next to what was then the Vogue women's store. I came out of Miss Willie's house with an armload of books to take back to the library. As I got close to my destination, I realized that the line of protesters blocked my way. The marchers were shouting and singing various songs and slogans. Among them were several students of mine from D.D. Crawford. When they saw me, they stopped shouting Black Power and similar shouts. And I heard someone say, "Hey, it's Mr. Twombly." Immediately, the line parted like the Red Sea, and they let me pass through. I'd like to think that was a little sign of things to come. Whether it was or not, things did get better, and we are now all the beneficiaries of a monumental historical change. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Charles, for a very interesting talk. And I do hope that lots of people out there listen, and some of the younger folks listen to what you had to say, so that they have an idea of what Washington County went through in those very important years. So thank you so much.
And thank you.